Before we begin, let me ask you a simple but uncomfortable question. How many English words have you memorized in your life? 1,000? 5,000? Maybe even more. You've made vocabulary lists, used flashcards, highlighted textbooks, installed apps, and promised yourself that once you learned enough words, speaking would finally become easy. And yet, here you are. You understand English, you can read articles, watch videos, and recognize complex expressions. But when it's time to speak, your mind slows down. Your voice hesitates. Sometimes nothing comes out at all. This is not a lack of effort, and it's definitely not a lack of intelligence. The truth is, memorizing vocabulary has become the most common hiding place for English learners around the world. It feels productive. It feels safe. It gives you the comforting illusion that you are moving forward, even when your speaking ability stays exactly where it is. In traditional learning systems, vocabulary is treated like currency. The more you collect, the richer you're supposed to become. But language does not work like money. You don't spend words one by one. You use language as a living system, in real time, under pressure, without preparation. That's why so many learners feel confused. They did everything they were told to do. They studied seriously, they memorized diligently, and yet the gap between what they know and what they can say keeps getting wider. In this episode of Think and Speak English, we are going to confront a difficult idea, one that may challenge the way you've been learning English for years. The problem is not that you don't know enough words. The problem is that memorizing words is not what creates the ability to speak. This episode is not about telling you to stop learning vocabulary completely. It's about understanding why vocabulary, when learned in isolation, often becomes the very thing that keeps you stuck. And once you see that clearly, you'll begin to understand why real fluency has very little to do with how many words you know, and everything to do with how your mind uses them. This is where the illusion breaks, and this is where real progress begins. If you're ready to stop collecting English and start using it, let's continue. To understand why memorizing vocabulary keeps you stuck, we need to start with a fundamental misunderstanding about how the brain works. Your brain is not a dictionary. It does not store words neatly, one by one, waiting for you to pull them out when you need them. That idea feels logical, especially if you were educated in systems that emphasize storage, lists, definitions, translations, and tests. But the human brain was never designed to function like a database. The brain is a survival system. Its primary job is not to preserve information, but to support action. When you memorize a word without using it, the brain registers that word as passive data. It recognizes it when you see or hear it, but it does not prepare that word for production. Recognition and usage are processed differently. One is observational, the other is motor-based and time-sensitive. This is why you can read a word and immediately understand it, yet completely fail to say it when speaking. The brain knows what the word means, but it has never practiced deploying it under real conditions. No timing, no pressure, no purpose. In real communication, the brain must act fast. It has to select words, assemble meaning, and release sound in a fraction of a second. There is no time to search through stored definitions. If a word is not linked to action, something you have done repeatedly, the brain will not prioritize it when speed matters. Think about how you learned to use your native language. You did not memorize words first and speak later. You spoke first, badly, repeatedly, and imperfectly. Words were learned inside actions, asking, refusing, reacting, explaining. Meaning was tied to use, not to memory. But when learning English as an adult, the process is reversed. You were asked to collect words before you were allowed to speak, and the brain adapts accordingly. It learns to observe English, analyze English, and judge English, but not to act with it. This is the core problem.
Words that are not connected to action remain inactive. They sit in the mind like unused tools, familiar but unreachable when you actually need them. And the more time you spend memorizing without using, the stronger this pattern becomes. So the issue is not that your brain failed to store the words. It stored them exactly as you trained it to, passively. And as we move forward, you'll see why this passive storage doesn't just fail to help your speaking, it actively slows it down.
Once the brain is filled with large amounts of passive vocabulary, a new problem appears, one that most learners never see coming. The more words you know, the harder it becomes to choose. When you try to speak, your brain does not simply ask, "What do I want to say?" Instead, it is forced into a complex decision-making process. Which word is correct? Which one sounds more natural? Is this formal or informal? Is there a better option, a more advanced one? Each extra word you memorize adds another option to evaluate. This creates cognitive overload. Speaking is a real-time activity. The brain must operate under strict time pressure. When there are too many choices, the system slows down. The brain hesitates, not because it lacks knowledge, but because it has too much of it, without clear priority. This is why learners who study vocabulary aggressively often feel their speaking getting worse, not better. At the beginner level, expression feels easier. You use simple words, you don't overthink. But as your vocabulary grows, so does your internal monitoring system. You begin to judge yourself before you speak. You search for the right word instead of saying a usable one. You delay speech in order to improve quality, and in that delay, fluency collapses. Fluent speakers do not pause to choose between 5 synonyms. They use the first word that works and move on. Their priority is meaning, not precision. But learners trained through memorization are conditioned to believe that better words equal better English. So when the brain sees many possible options, it hesitates. And hesitation, repeated often enough, becomes silence. This is not a confidence issue, it is a processing issue. The brain is overloaded with data that has never been organized by usage. Without repetition in real speaking contexts, the brain cannot rank words by usefulness. Everything feels equally important, equally risky, equally uncertain. And when everything feels uncertain, the safest option is to say nothing. This is how knowing more words paradoxically makes speaking slower, not because vocabulary is bad, but because vocabulary without hierarchy, without repetition, and without action becomes noise. And in the next part, you'll see what the brain does with that noise over time, and why most of it simply disappears. Over time, the brain begins to solve this overload problem in the most efficient way it knows how. It deletes what it does not need. The brain is constantly optimizing for survival. It keeps what is useful, strengthens what is repeated, and removes what consumes energy without producing results. This process happens automatically, without emotion and without apology. When a word is memorized but never used, the brain receives a clear signal. This information is not necessary for action. It may appear in recognition when reading or listening, but it is never called upon when something needs to be done. So the brain gradually deprioritizes it. This is why so many learners experience a strange frustration. They remember learning a word before. They feel that it is familiar, but when they try to recall it while speaking, it is gone. Not forgotten in the traditional sense, but inaccessible when speed matters. This is not a memory failure, it is a relevance decision. Studies of learning consistently show that information not retrieved and applied gets weaker over time. But language makes this effect even stronger, because speaking requires immediate retrieval. If a word cannot be accessed quickly, the brain treats it as unreliable and avoids it altogether. That is why a small group of basic words often becomes dominant in your speech, while thousands of others remain silent in your mind. The brain keeps what works and discards what doesn't.
This leads to a painful realization for many learners. Most of the vocabulary they worked so hard to memorize never becomes usable. It exists only as recognition knowledge, useful for tests, but irrelevant for communication. And the more this happens, the more learners feel betrayed by the learning process. They assume they need to memorize even more words to compensate, not realizing they are reinforcing the same cycle. The truth is uncomfortable but simple. Words that are not used do not survive. The brain does not care how much time you spent learning them. It only cares whether they help you act. And once you understand this, it becomes clear why adding more vocabulary does not solve the speaking problem. It only increases the amount of material the brain must filter out. To move forward, the strategy must change, not by learning more, but by using what is already there.
When you observe people who speak English fluently, a surprising pattern appears, one that contradicts almost everything most learners believe. Fluent speakers do not use a wide or impressive vocabulary. They rely on a small, familiar set of words repeated across countless situations. These words are not advanced, they are not elegant, but they are deeply practiced. The speaker does not search for them. They arrive automatically without effort. This is because fluency is not built on variety, it is built on familiarity. A fluent speaker may know many words, but when speaking, the brain chooses speed over sophistication. It reaches for words that have been used hundreds or thousands of times before, words that are linked to action, emotion, and real communication. This is why you often hear native or fluent speakers repeat the same phrases again and again, not because they lack vocabulary, but because repetition creates rhythm, and rhythm creates flow. Learners, on the other hand, are often trained to avoid repetition. They are encouraged to use new words, better words, more complex expressions. Over time, this creates the belief that repeating simple words is a sign of weakness. But in real communication, repetition is strength. Using the same core words in different contexts allows the brain to automate production. The mind stops thinking about language and starts focusing on meaning. That is the moment when speaking begins to feel natural. Most fluent speakers operate with a core vocabulary of a few hundred words that do most of the work. These words are flexible. They can express ideas, emotions, opinions, and reactions. More advanced words exist on the edges, used occasionally, not constantly. This is the opposite of how most learners train. They try to expand outward before building depth. They collect words but never stay with any of them long enough to make them automatic. Fluency, however, is not about how much you know. It is about how well your brain knows what to do with what you do know. And until vocabulary is repeated, recycled, and used in real situations, it remains knowledge, not speech. To understand why repetition matters so much, it helps to look at two very different types of learners. The first type is what we might call a word collector. This person is always learning new vocabulary, new apps, new lists, new expressions. Their attention is focused on expansion. More words feel like progress. The second type is a language user. This person may not actively chase new vocabulary at all. Instead, they take a small set of words and push them into real use. They say the same things in different ways. They repeat ideas. They recycle language. On the surface, the word collector often looks more advanced. They recognize more words. They score higher on tests. They can explain grammar rules. But when comes time to speak, something breaks down. The language user, by contrast, may sound simple. Their sentences are not impressive, but they speak without stopping. They communicate clearly, and most importantly, they are understood. The difference is not intelligence or talent, it is intention. Word collectors treat English as an object to be mastered. Language users treat English as a tool to be used. One focuses on accumulation, the other focuses on application. This difference shows up in behavior. Word collectors hesitate because they are searching for the best possible word. Language users speak because they are searching for connection. One is internally focused, the other is externally focused. Over time, these habits shape the brain.
The word collector's brain becomes good at recognition and evaluation. The language user's brain becomes good at production and timing. This is why so many learners feel stuck despite knowing so much. They trained their minds to observe English, not to act with it. And observation does not lead to fluency. Fluency is built by doing fewer things more often. And the more you prioritize usage over collection, the faster your speaking ability begins to move.
As vocabulary grows, another invisible barrier begins to form, one that affects advanced and intelligent learners more than anyone else. With more knowledge comes more expectation. When you know many words, you don't just want to speak, you want to speak well. You want your English to reflect your level, your education, your intelligence, and that desire creates pressure. Before you say anything, an internal filter activates. Is this word accurate enough? Is this sentence too simple? Could I express this more precisely? The mind starts editing before the mouth has a chance to move. This self-monitoring feels responsible, it feels mature, but in real-time communication, it is destructive. Fluent speech requires momentum. Once momentum is interrupted by evaluation, timing collapses. The brain misses the window where speech can flow naturally and silence takes its place. This is why highly educated learners often struggle more than beginners. Beginners have nothing to protect. They speak freely because there is no standard to maintain. Advanced learners, however, carry the weight of their own knowledge. They are no longer afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of sounding less capable than they are. This fear is subtle but powerful. It convinces the brain that it is safer to wait, to refine, to improve internally before speaking. But language does not reward waiting. It rewards participation. Over time, this habit of self-censorship becomes automatic. The brain learns that speaking English is a high-risk activity that requires careful control. And when risk feels high, the natural response is delay. This is how intelligence becomes a trap, not because smart learners cannot speak, but because they demand too much from themselves in the moment of speaking. Fluency is not the result of saying the best possible thing. It is the result of saying the first workable thing and continuing forward. And until that internal pressure is released, vocabulary will remain a burden instead of a resource. To move past this pressure, we need to understand what speaking really is and what it is not. Speaking is not a memory task. It is a reflex. Reflexes are fast. They are automatic. They do not wait for conscious permission. When you touch something hot, you pull your hand back instantly. You do not stop to analyze the temperature or review what you learned about heat. Your body reacts because the pathway has been trained through repetition and experience. Language works the same way. When you speak fluently, your brain is not searching through stored vocabulary. It is executing patterns that have been repeated so often they no longer require thought. Words come out not because you remembered them, but because your brain has learned to release them without hesitation. This is why memorization alone can never create speaking ability. Memorization trains recognition. It helps you identify a word when you see it or hear it, but recognition is slow. It waits, it observes. Reflexive speech, on the other hand, acts immediately. It does not ask for permission from your conscious mind. Most learners confuse these two systems. They assume that if a word is stored in memory, it will automatically appear in speech. But without repetition in real speaking contexts, the brain never builds the neural pathway required for fast production. The word remains passive, even if it is perfectly understood. This explains a common frustration. I know the word, but I can't say it. The problem is not forgetting. The problem is that the word was never trained as an action. Reflexes are built through use, not understanding, through doing the same thing again and again, even imperfectly, until the brain decides it is safe to automate. And this is where most English learners go wrong. They spend years feeding the brain information, but very little time asking it to perform. As a result, the brain becomes excellent at recognizing English and terrible at producing it. Until speaking is practiced as a reflex, no amount of vocabulary will ever feel available when you need it. And once you see that clearly, the next realization is unavoidable. Knowing words and being able to use them are two completely different skills.
Once you accept that speaking is a reflex, the next question becomes unavoidable.
Why does this reflex disappear so easily for adult learners? The answer lies in how the brain prioritizes survival. Your brain is constantly deciding which skills are worth automating. Automation is expensive. It requires energy, repetition, and risk. So the brain only commits when it believes a skill will be used frequently and safely. For most adult English learners, speaking English fails both tests. English is often practiced in isolation, alone, silently, inside the head. There is no urgency, no real consequence, no social pressure that signals to the brain this matters right now. As a result, the brain classifies speaking English as an optional knowledge, not a necessary reflex. Even worse, many adults experience repeated emotional friction when they try to speak: hesitation, self-correction, fear of sounding stupid, fear of judgment. Every time this happens, the brain records speaking English as a high-risk activity, and the brain avoids automating risky behaviors. So instead of strengthening the speaking pathway, the brain does the opposite. It slows it down. It reroutes speech through conscious control. It forces you to think, translate, and check before speaking, because thinking feels safer than acting. This is why adults often speak worse than they should. The more intelligent and self-aware you are, the stronger this problem becomes. Your brain interferes to protect your identity, your image, your sense of competence. Silence feels safer than imperfect speech. Over time, this creates a vicious cycle. Because speaking feels uncomfortable, you avoid it. Because you avoid it, the reflex weakens. Because the reflex weakens, speaking becomes even more stressful. Eventually, your brain learns a dangerous rule: English is something to understand, not something to use. Breaking this pattern requires more than learning techniques. It requires changing how you send the signals to your brain, signals that say speaking is normal, frequent, and safe enough to automate. And until those signals change, the reflex will never return, no matter how many words you know. At this point, many learners reach a familiar conclusion: I just need to learn more. More vocabulary, more grammar, more advanced structures. And this belief feels logical because knowledge is measurable, controllable, and safe. But this is precisely why learning more does not solve the speaking problem. When you add more input without changing how you use the language, you increase cognitive load instead of fluency. Your brain now has more options to choose from, more rules to check, more possibilities to evaluate, all of which must be processed before you speak. This slows the reflex even further. Speaking is not blocked by a lack of information, it is blocked by too much information competing for control. Think about it this way: you do not hesitate to say your name in your native language, not because it is simple, but because it is automatic. There is no internal debate, no searching, no evaluation. The response fires instantly. Now compare that to English. Each time you try to speak, your brain asks, is this the right word? Is the tense correct? Is there a better expression? Will this sound natural? Every new thing you learn adds another question to this internal checklist. So instead of freeing your speech, learning more traps you inside your head. This is why many advanced learners speak worse than intermediate ones. Beginners speak with mistakes but with momentum. Advanced learners speak with accuracy but without flow. They are managing a system, not using a language. And the brain cannot automate what it must constantly supervise. Fluency does not come from expansion, it comes from reduction. Reducing thinking, reducing choice, reducing self-monitoring. Until the learning process shifts from accumulation to activation, speaking will always feel heavy, no matter how much you know. That is the final truth of this section. You are not stuck because you have learned too little. You are stuck because learning has replaced using. And as long as learning remains the center, speaking will stay on the outside.
At this stage, something important must change, not in your effort, but in your direction.
Up to now, we have dismantled a comforting illusion that vocabulary accumulation leads to fluency. And once that illusion collapses, many learners feel uneasy. Because if memorizing more words is not the solution, then the real question becomes uncomfortable. So what should I be doing instead? This is the moment where most people either break through or return to the old habits that feel productive but keep them stuck. Because shifting from memorizing to speaking is not just a learning adjustment. It is a mental shift. It requires letting go of control, accepting imperfection, and trusting a process that does not deliver immediate proof of progress. And that is difficult, especially for intelligent, disciplined learners. In Think and Speak English, we call this the transition gap, the space between knowing what does not work and not yet understanding what does. Most people never cross this gap. They go back to flashcards, lists, and apps, not because they help, but because they are familiar. But fluency lives on the other side of this gap. In the next section, we will step into what actually creates speaking ability. Not theory, not memory, not intelligence, but a completely different relationship with language. One that retrains the brain to respond instead of reflect. If you have ever felt that English is in your head but not in your mouth, then what comes next is where everything begins to change. Before we end this episode, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on one simple question. How long have you been learning English, and how often do you actually use it without thinking? If your answer makes you uncomfortable, that is not a failure. It is clarity. Today, we did not talk about shortcuts or tricks. We talked about the real reasons so many people stay stuck for years, because they were taught to collect English instead of live inside it. Vocabulary became knowledge, not action. Learning became safety, not progress. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. This is exactly why Think and Speak English exists. This channel is not about sounding perfect. It's about retraining your mind so English becomes a natural response, not a performance. Because when you upgrade your mind, you automatically improve your English. If this episode resonated with you, do not let it end here. Subscribe to Think and Speak English and stay with us as we move from awareness to action.
In the next episode, we will break down what actually builds speaking reflexes and how to start activating the English you already have. Remember this, you do not need more English. You need a different way to use it. This is Think and Speak English. Upgrade your mind, improve your English.